I'll just tell you a little interlude before we start. My research background is in theatre, and at the moment I'm dealing with an acting school in London and doing some work with these actors. Anyway, or potential actors. Anyway, I came back the other night on Halloween, and I'd cooking myself some dinner, and there was a bang, bang, bang on the door. You see, so I go to the door, and thinking it must be my neighbour who's got a parcel or something. And I open the door, and there were these two kids dressed up in ghoulish outfits, you know. I sat back, and the little one whipped off his mask. He said, "Don't be afraid, I'm only 8. Those of you who know Midsummer Night's Dream might make a connection there. Anyway, I want to introduce John Drakakis, who's going to introduce Emma. Those of you in English studies, and particularly in Shakespeare studies, know that that John is someone with others who changed the nature of English studies in the 80s. And his book on alternative Shakespeares, for example, along with the work of Dollimore and Sinfield and others, actually made us think again about the very nature of the study of English. He's a great scholar, a great researcher, and a great friend. So I'd like you to ask John if he'd come and or stay there and introduce Emma. John Drakakis.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, no problem at the back. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mike. When you meet the person whom you've described, I'd like to meet him myself. Okay. I'd like to introduce Professor Emma Smith. It's a great pleasure to introduce her. We've bumped into each other at various conferences around the world. I think the last time was in Calcutta, Emma. She's Professor of English at Hertford College in the university here. And she's a Shakespearean, but with various tentacles reaching out into other areas of Renaissance studies and areas of Shakespeare pedagogy. She's best known for 2 books which are rapidly becoming standard reading matter. The Making of Shakespeare's First Folio, which was published in 2015, and then another sort of approach to the first folio, which was a history of its reception until it became an iconic book. And that's Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 centuries of an iconic book. This is not just a bibliographical exercise. I mean, there's a lot of heavy-duty textual bibliography involved there. It's also an important cultural history, and it raises questions of who Shakespeare's first readers were, how they actually read this book, and how it became the book that we now recognize. She's also published on Christopher Marlowe, and she's done the Cambridge Guide to Shakespeare, and as most Renaissance scholars do, she's entered into the area of textual editing, and she's edited 5 revenge tragedies for Penguin. So it's a very wide conspectus. She's published some wonderful articles in Shakespeare Quarterly, Review of English Studies, Shakespeare Studies, and Shakespeare Survey, and she's on the board, the editorial board of Shakespeare Survey. And along with Laurie Maguire, she's recently published an essay that rethinks Shakespeare's use of source material, particularly in relation to Marlowe. She's going to talk on something that I don't actually recognize from her from her CV, but it promises to be extremely provocative. It's vocation versus profession in English studies. So, Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me. Thank you very much to you for coming. I was relieved that in one of Kathy's slides about the advantages of a humanities, particularly perhaps an English PhD, understanding present problems in a historical context was given as one of our skills. That's certainly what I'm going to try and propose today. So I'm going to propose two kinds of genealogies, if you like, of a predicament I see as in the academic English department right now. They're located in late 19th century Oxford, and I'm going to try and set those up as potential, as a sign of where we came from, but perhaps as some kind of fruitful possibilities for where we might go next. But I want to begin with what I think has to be the urtext for the scholarly profession, Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus, the story, as you know, of a Wittenberg theologian who enters a pact with the devil, an overdetermined moment in the cultural history of scholarship, as well as an overdetermined text for histories of the Renaissance. I want to start perhaps by pointing out some unexpected parallels to the modern academy. Dr. Faustus turns out to be unexpectedly prescient about contemporary academic issues. The chorus to the play points out that Faustus, in that phrase we are all coming to understand, is a first-generation academic. Now is he born of parents' base of stock in Germany within a town called Rode. He is graced with doctor's name. Any of you who follow Twitter will know that the question of whether you should call yourself doctor, if you are not in fact a medical practitioner, has been surprisingly alive and has earned the hashtag immodest women. It's mostly been associated with women, but perhaps we could give Faustus hashtag immodest man. He uses, we have the title for his play, of course, but he uses it himself for his bond with Mephistopheles. I, John Faustus of Wittenberg, doctor, by these presents do give both body and soul to Lucifer, Prince of the East. Like many academics, he asks a lot of questions, although he doesn't actually listen to the answers. Whatever and however many books he has, they are never enough. He is often in his study at midnight. He seems to have no private or family life to speak of and no hobbies. Like modern academic conference goers, he makes a number of short, exhausting trips around the world. Not long he stayed within his quiet house to rest his bones after his weary toil, but new exploits do hail him out again. His students all feel it is rather a long time since they saw him and grumble about Wittenberg's key performance indicators on contact time. He has, and we must be sympathetic with him here, the mother of all deadlines to meet at the end of the play. And with it, an awfully perverse version of a defined benefits pension, albeit after only 24 years' service. His impact case study, this is a UK-specific reference, I'm afraid, but his impact case study could be extraordinary, especially now that here in the UK, Ref 2021 has allowed for dead colleagues' work to be submitted as part of a departmental research profile. If Faustus then is a cautionary tale for modern academia, his story has always been understood in the light of different attitudes to learning and the academy. Critics, for instance, have argued about the extent of Faustus's own learning in terms which inevitably capture their own attitude to the academic world. Earlier scholars were much more impressed by the extent of Faustus's knowledge. And it's an interesting phenomenon that as literary scholarship has expanded, particularly over the last 3 decades, the idea that Faustus could be considered a serious thinker has been in parallel retreat. As the university world has become more research-focused, it has become easier and more obvious to take down Faustus's own claims to learning. One particular version of this long critical history might be characterized in this question. Is Faustus a thinker who overreaches himself in the pursuit of knowledge wherever it goes, and thus a model, albeit a negative one, for a kind of scholarship as intellectual journey? Or do we see Faustus as merely self-interested and ambitious, keen for earthly rewards for this ill-gotten knowledge? Is it knowledge of the ineffable that Faustus seeks, or the more worldly currency of Orient pearl? Is the philosopher's stone to which he aspires something to cure disease or make him rich? To put this another way, should we understand his post at the University of Wittenberg to be a vocation or a profession? I want, in this short talk, to think about the so-called crisis in the humanities now by focusing on 19th century Oxford and on two competing ideas of humanistic study that I think continue to shape current disciplines and their discontents. They're also two quite local stories, parallel and mutually constitutive discourses focusing on the University of Oxford, which have wider implications for disciplinary institutions now. On the one hand, I want to explore the deliciously outraged response to Walter Pater's Studies in the Renaissance, published in 1873 and roundly condemned or celebrated, depending on your point of view, as a manifesto for aesthetic debauchery. On the other hand, I want to think about the contemporaneous arguments for establishing a school of English in the University of Oxford, and about how that new discipline might properly situate itself in relation to adjacent humanities subjects, particularly classics, history and philology, but also in relation to an ongoing institutional tension still unresolved between teaching and research. Whether humanistic studies, and particularly English studies, should be understood as vocation or profession is up for grabs in Oxford in the 1890s, and I think that's in ways that can shape our current debates. Perhaps I should just clarify the terms there, because sometimes I think we use the word vocational in higher education to think about a kind of instrumental or pragmatic kind of degree that will lead to some kind of job. I'm using the word kind of profession for that sense of university learning. And for vocation, many people in this room in particular won't need that. I'm thinking about a different kind of calling, a different kind of relation to day-to-day work, a different sense of what's work and what isn't, and a different sense of commitment to the objects of study. I hope that will become clearer as I go through. Walter Pater was not the first to use the term Renaissance in English scholarship, but his book Studies in the Renaissance had such an impact that we can take it as a placeholder for the introduction of that word into Victorian culture. Pater's 1873 book of collected essays used, as you'll know, Renaissance art and the poems of Michelangelo to propose a radically aesthetic approach to artistic culture. For Pater, the question prompted by Renaissance art was a question of individual response. What is this song or picture, this engaging personality presented in life or in a book to me? What effect does it really produce on me? Does it give me pleasure? And if so, what sort or degree of pleasure? And in his conclusion to Studies in the Renaissance, Pater passionately expounds the signal importance of a life lived intensely and experientially. Of this wisdom, the poetic passion, the desire of beauty, the love of art for art's sake has most. For art comes to you, professing frankly to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for those moments' sake. Reviewers were not slow to pick up the implications here. The Saturday Review noted that, quote, "The reader runs, no doubt, some danger of being carried far away by an alluring imagination and by a singularly seductive diction." I think many people were exactly delighted by being carried so far away. One Cambridge cleric preached against the wretched and base idea of crowning life with the greatest number of pleasurable sensations. Mrs. Oliphant disapproved of it in terms that wonderfully anticipate Susan Sontag's aesthetic of camp a century later, calling Pater bad taste and conventional originality combining to produce a rococo effect, she says, is the very madness of fantastic modernism. Pater's account of the German classicist Winckelmann and his, quote, romantic, fervent friendships with young men seemed at best to normalize his homosexuality and at worst to elevate it into a marker of intellectual distinction. It was the foundation, perhaps, of Winckelmann's ability to achieve a privileged insight into the ancient world. To be queer, then, was, according to Pater, to exist in a more intense relation to the aesthetic realm. By all means, wrote Sidney Colvin with some distaste in the Pall Mall Gazette, let the people whose bent is art follow art. By all means, refine the pleasures of as many people as possible, but do not tell everybody that refined pleasure is the one end of life. It was clearly an open secret that the real bent Pater was promulgating was, on the one hand, religious skepticism, and on the other, a classicized manifesto for male homosexuality, and thus Renaissance, in the hands of Pater and his respondents, gathered the currency of shared euphemism. Pater's studies in the Renaissance had a particular resonance in Oxford, where Pater was fellow in classics at Brasenose. After its publication, his once friend, the chaplain of his college, wrote to him sorrowfully, asking him to withdraw from examining its candidates in divinity. The Bishop of Oxford preached against the neo-paganism of the book's conclusion. Benjamin Jowett, Master of Balliol, described its author as a demoralizing moralizer and resolved, quote, to subvert his influence. The novelist Mrs. Humphrey Ward later recalled, quote, the strange and poignant sense of beauty expressed in it, of its entire aloofness also from the Christian tradition of Oxford, its glorification of the higher and intenser forms of aesthetic pleasure. For the second and subsequent editions until 1888, Pater withdrew that conclusion about art for art's sake, but its impact on a generation of aesthetes, most notably Oscar Wilde, for whom it was the golden book, was indelible. But Pater's own personal and intellectual association with aestheticism and homosexuality terminally damaged his Oxford career. His account of the Renaissance was effectively extramural, outside of the university, a kind of queer Jude the Obscure. Victorian critics, influenced by Pater's Renaissance, developed that idea of passionately felt engagement into more obviously literary territory. And this leads us back, surprisingly perhaps, to Christopher Marlowe, whose own scandalous biography was located archivally in the discovery of the so-called Baines Note, a document outlining Marlowe's many so-called monstrous opinions, and foremost among them his Wildean epigram that all that love not tobacco and boys be fools. Baines's note about Marlowe was published for the first time in a book about a book called Sexual Deviance by Havelock Ellis, the Victorian sexologist. Paterites, including Ellis and John Addington Symonds, identified Marlowe as the literary equivalent of Michelangelo and promulgated that same Paterian passionate identification with aesthetics. In 1882, Ellis and Symonds produced the first ever collected edition of Christopher Marlowe's plays. Ellis edited the texts, Symonds set them into a context of Renaissance theatre. The volume includes 5 plays, as you see here. They're the 2 parts of Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, the Jew of Malta, and Edward II. It's wonderfully and unsubtly described as an unexpurgated edition, which seems something you could only possibly put to stir up unseemly expectations. So the unexpurgated edition of all these plays. And for Symonds, Marlowe had become key to the English Renaissance. It was irrevocably he, Symonds says, who decided the destiny of the romantic drama. The whole subsequent evolution of that species, including Shakespeare's world, can be regarded as the expansion, reification, and artistic ennoblement of the time fixed by Marlowe's epoch-making tragedies. By bringing Pater's Italian Renaissance back home, Ellis and Symonds were able to mobilise its passionate aesthetic engagement towards a patriotic fervour for vernacular literature, suggesting that Marlowean drama has, in this long quotation, I'll just pick out a couple of bits, the freedom of a great race conscious of their adolescent vigour, and a freedom from pedantry, from servility to scholastic rules, from observance of foreign or antiquated models. Marlowe's drama, thus, like Pater's Renaissance art, is transgressive in ways that connect sexual, cultural, and aesthetic experiment. So far then, I've been arguing about a construction of the Renaissance in late 19th century English culture that generates from Italian art and from its aesthetic appreciations a strong association between aesthetic appreciation and homosexuality, and then about the emerging centrality of Marlowe as the inevitable literary correlative of that. Marlowe becomes central to narratives of Renaissance literature at a crucial point, really because he is amenable to Paterian forms of interpretation. For Pater, the aesthetic appreciation of the Renaissance was a way of life, not a means of living. He urged readers to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame to maintain this ecstasy. It is success in life. To maintain this ecstasy is success in life. That I want to take as a kind of extreme embodiment of a kind of vocation idea of aesthetic engagement. To maintain this ecstasy is success in life. Ecstasy may not be the most obvious term on which to pivot the argument towards the institutionalisation of English studies, but let's just move across town from Pater's Brasenose to trace more briefly a parallel, but I think inseparable narrative. The arguments over establishing a school and a discipline of English studies at the University of Oxford are not, of course, identical with the larger movement to establish English as a university subject elsewhere in the country. That's a movement where actually I think extension and extramural schools, particularly the London colleges, have a really important role to play. We shouldn't try and annex that. But the Oxford arguments are particularly well documented because what was taught in the Oxford curriculum then as now had a particular fascination for wider literate culture. And debates about the role of English in university life were conducted not only in Oxford's own parochial press, but in the Westminster Review, the Pall Mall Gazette, and the Times. Thus, debates about the establishment of English at the University of Oxford serve as a lens for larger cultural debates about English studies at the end of the 19th century. But there's also something about the proximity of these debates to Pater's Oxford, to those studies in the Renaissance that, as Mrs. Humphrey Ward recalled, stirred and scandalised Oxford. I want to suggest that Pater's version of the Renaissance in all its aesthetic, queer, experiential, art for art's sake intensity is the uncanny double that simultaneously secures and undermines the identity of the new discipline. It's a kind of abject, imaginary uncanniness, as Christeva would put it, and real threat. It beckons to us and ends up engulfing us. Pater's queerly intense Renaissance, then, is the disciplinary abject or double for English studies as they come to be argued over and institutionalised in the context of late Victorian Oxford. Arguments about what English literature might look like as a university subject and how it might be examined were prosecuted by various interest groups during the middle decades of the 19th century. University examinations, as we all know, have part of their particular stresses the fact that what is being really tested is not in fact the candidates at all, but different conceptions of the discipline we can all the rest of the year pretend we follow collectively. When we disagree with fellow markers at all, it's, after all, I think that's only rarely or partially about the presenting issue, the script in front of us. Here's a range then of sample examination questions that were asked on English literature material in colleges, extension classes and civil service examinations during the middle years of the 19th century, to give some sense of the kinds of work English literature was already doing and trying to encourage as it directed its students towards careers in the civil service or other forms of Victorian bureaucracy. I was really struck by what Cathy was saying about the kind of how the examinations or the assessments or the tests, the outputs of graduate study shape entirely what that curriculum and what that experience is. This is something we can see is very similar. We won't have a test on this, but perhaps you could, who did write Gamma Gurton's Needle and when, and trace briefly the plot. State what you know concerning the personal history of Donne, Cowley, Lee, Butler and Otway. Give reasons for believing Descartes not to have been the Crispinus of Ben John's Poetaster. So some of them are kind of weirdly 1066 and all that specific. And some, I love the first one, who is the first distinguished writer of English prose? Point out the characteristic features of his style and say in what respect it differs from that of Lord Clarendon. So this is the field of literary study as we can deduce back from its examination questions in the 19th century, before Oxford establishes its English school. The developments about developing an English school at the University of Oxford were taken up in earnest in the early 1870s. So they're therefore exactly contemporaneous with Pater's Studies in the Renaissance, first edition 1873, second 1877. In part, those English school discussions are part of a much larger debate about the 19th century institution, which is concerned about the role of the university in teaching and in higher research, and that in turn is part of a larger Oxford quarrel between reformers and traditionalists. In the matter of the proposed English curriculum, the traditionalists were surprisingly perhaps on the side of a discipline that favoured the new school, that favoured the teaching of English literature. It was the reformers who were keen on a more research-driven university, a kind of higher skilled university, who were more keen on English language in the form of philology. Philology already existed in the university. So one of the early arguments then is between literature and teaching on the one hand and philology and research on the other. English literature advocates thought that they had secured a decisive victory in this ongoing campaign when the Merton Chair of English Language and Literature, pay £900 per annum, was founded with a field which explicitly included literature, so they thought this was the moment. Unfortunately, the appointment panel were not so minded. How things have changed. The appointment of Göttingen's scholar Arthur Napier, who was a chemist turned Anglo-Saxon lexicographer, reigned rather on the literary parade. What's important about this moment is that scholarship and teaching are seen to occupy really entirely different specialist fields. That too may be something that we want to come back to. Advocates of English literature, chief among them an indefatigable gentleman called John Churton Collins, who, as it happens or not, had been an unsuccessful candidate for that Merton chair taken up by Arthur Napier. Those advocates flitted between different kinds of disciplinary or institutional alliances. They wanted to match up really with either with history or with classics in order to mount a sustained campaign against the detested philology. History was much, there's Churton Collins, and here's his study of English literature, a plea for its recognition and organisation at the universities. This is a collection of all his many, many articles in retrospect. But there's some nice, I don't know if you can see them in his chapter headings, agitation at Oxford and the foundation of a chair of English. Somebody's marked that. Renewal of attempt to establish a school of literature at Oxford. Strength of the philologist party in the university, page 12. So history, Churton Collins' first and preferred ally was going to be history. But history was not going to play at all. The Regius Professor, William Stubbs, was completely opposed. To have the history school hampered with dilettante teaching, such as the teaching of English literature, must necessarily do great harm to the school. Churton Collins continued to try to woo history, but it was no dice, and he very reluctantly turned to classics, He was worried, in fact, I think, that classics carried the Pater taint. We all know what Renaissance means. In search of this pragmatic disciplinary alliance, Churton Collins argued that classical literatures were the necessary background and intellectual backbone of his new discipline. Take, he says, for example, the poetry of Milton. Could anything be more preposterous than for a man to undertake to comment on Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, on Comus and on Samson Agonistes, who was unacquainted with the literatures which were to Milton's genius what soil is to a plant? Like those exam questions we looked at, even the form of Churton Collins' suggestion is quite a long way from Pater's burning with a hard gem-like flame. Collins' scorn for philology was promulgated in a stream of articles and letters to periodicals. His English graduates would, he predicted, emerge from their studies with what we would now call transferable skills. Whatever will be the future calling of these students, whatever will be the future calling of these students, the positive knowledge they will have attained will, unlike a knowledge of philology, be of immense and immediate service to them. The liberal training to which, in the course of acquiring that knowledge, they have been submitted will, unlike the narrow and narrowing discipline of mere philological culture, send them forth with enlarged minds and with cultivated tastes. These manly products of the new syllabus would be able to do national and imperial work. Seeking support from notable Victorians, Collins produced commendations from the Archbishop of Canterbury, from Matthew Arnold and William Gladstone, among others, all of whom agreed that men trained in English literature could perform a valuable public service. I think manliness and its cognates in discussions about English studies is a really interesting topic I haven't really done enough with. It's clearly articulated against Pater, so it's manliness as opposed to effeminacy, but it's also, I think, beginning to articulate itself against the beginnings of the feminization of higher education in the development of women's education. That's quite interesting in the light of the gender profile of most contemporary English studies degrees now. And it's a worrying thought that perhaps the crisis in the humanities and the proportion of women in the humanities might not somehow be connected. Churton Collins produced his own sample examination questions for the new English degree in an attempt to persuade doubters of the intellectual and analytical calibre of his proposed curriculum. If we look at these, we can see still that the questions are not trying to cue individual recall. We're not trying to remember the plot of Gamma Gurton's Needle. But what we are doing is something more like intellectual history. What were the causes that conspired to form the Elizabethan age, one wonders? And in what way and to what extent are peculiarities in the work of Spenser and Shakespeare directly attributable to them or to any of them? What these questions do not seem to require, indeed, what they are deliberately seeking to direct candidates away from, seems to me anything like the question Pater was so fervently asking. Remember, what is this song or picture, this engaging personality presented in a life or in a book to me? What effect does it really produce on me? Does it give me pleasure? And if so, what sort or degree of pleasure? Pater's Renaissance translated into the study of Marlowe, on the one hand, and Churton Collins' establishment support for English literature as a fine training for imperial administrators establish for me two potential genealogies of the literary or humanities department, the vocational and the professional. Many of our departments of English are, I think, still caught between these two models. Websites and prospectuses aimed at potential students register the tension between a vision of the discipline that is about individual exploration and self-fulfillment and a vision of the discipline that is about critical writing and research skills for the information-heavy age. Some examples here. As well as giving you a detailed knowledge of English literature from across the UK and beyond, we'll train you to become an independent researcher, critical and creative thinker, and persuasive writer. Or, employers regard the English degree as intellectually rigorous, and the skills which you will develop as an English student are transferable to many different fields. You will gain rigorous analytical and communication skills which make our English graduates sought after in the workplace. English students acquire a range of valuable skills which they can transfer to many different employment situations. Your literary and linguistic training can also be used in journalism, librarianship, teaching, and the highly competitive fields of acting, writing, and directing. You will also gain other skills such as the capacity to analyse and summarise material, to communicate, to work to a deadline, to argue a case, to work independently as well as collaboratively, to think logically, and to be able to use computers. We encourage you to interpret not only the text you'll read, but also the world around you in more subtle and penetrating ways. Now, some of these skills do sound a bit lame, quoted out of the context of the PR work we all do for our departments and schools. We probably all find ourselves caught between a transferable skills model and a passionate engagement model. But we don't, it seems to me, tell a very compelling or coherent story about whether our discipline is really about narcissistic self-indulgence and self-realization, or instrumentalist work for wider society, or whatever has happened to the empire. The problem then in English studies for students, for early career scholars, for established academics, departmental chairs and deans seems to me a problem of assessing competing claims across this divide. In part, of course, that's to do with English studies' long sense of disciplinary inferiority compared with the other humanities. We're always worried that what we do is not really difficult enough. It's what cultured people have always done after work, read books and chat about them. Anxieties about the ordinariness, the de-skilledness of our discipline has shaped its many iterations through the 20th century now. And I think it's made English studies in some ways more prickly than other humanities disciplines about the notion of public engagement and outreach. It's precisely because so many people outside the academy do or seem to do exactly the same thing that we do, read books and enjoy them and discuss them, that it's hard for us to quite know how to pitch our skills in that field. So I've come to a point then between Pater and Collins, and there's a way in this talk that I feel I could have a final paragraph that says it's quite clear which way we should go. And it could be one or it could be the other. When I was talking with some of this material to an audience largely composed of early career colleagues, I wanted to urge them very much against a vocational model of English studies. I think that's what drives them into the ground and gives them some of the anxieties that Cathy was talking about before. On the other hand, though, and not least because Cathy has talked so persuasively about that engaged model of English pedagogy and English discipline, I think I do want, on this occasion, to suggest we need to go one side of this divide or the other, vocation or profession. I think what I would like to say is that English studies has come from the margins of the institution, and maybe actually we're not at a point where incremental change is the right thing to do. Maybe we need to spring this discipline back out of the university again. I don't see that the crisis in the humanities is a problem for wider society, but it's certainly an institutional problem for the university. There are many ways one might deal with that. But ultimately, I think what I want to suggest and open up for discussion is that if we are looking at Pater as our model or Collins as our model for what English studies should be, I think I'd like to say, be more Pater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that very provocative talk. I'm sure it will generate questions. And we have, I think, probably about 10 or 15 minutes in which we can take questions. If anybody has any while you're thinking about it. Sorry, where are you? Ah, there you go. Yeah.
So, I have a graduate student who's working for me who is an arts for art's sake, Paterist person, and she expresses a lot of grief at the possibility of having to leave that model behind and work in regular employment. And I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I mean, my maybe two pragmatic response is that I feel that I've done both my entire career. Wrote a poem yesterday, read some literary criticism the day before that, read a novel the day before that, and then I'm here doing this. So it doesn't seem like it has to be in opposition to each other, but maybe that's not quite right. One of the projects that we had at Georgetown last spring was a non-credit certificate in public and engaged humanities. Did very little advertising, had very limited budget for that. But we had, in less than 3 weeks, 46 applications from graduate students, and we were able to take about 26 of them. And of the 26, 25 said that they got a lot out of it, and they wrote wonderful evaluations, and one wrote that we had destroyed the profession for him, and that he felt devastated at the knowledge that we had shared with him. So I wish I had a better answer to these students. I mean, the object is not to take their joy away, right, but to bring more joy. Do you have an answer?
Probably not, but I think that in some ways that's about the role of the graduate school, isn't it? And what we think graduate school education is for, and why that has, why really that looms so large in our concept of the discipline. Is graduate education, it seems to me that we're trying to move graduate education in the humanities from a model where its main purpose was to service graduate education in the humanities. I mean, it was a completely closed system that what you did was to, and it's great to hear what Kathy was saying before about the ways to reconfigure graduate school to serve a more kind of social or distributed idea of the humanities. I think that's actually really, really important. I suppose one of the things I wonder is whether it has worked for the humanities to ape so closely the language and the values of other parts of the university, or whether we always look as if actually we're not. If you're talking about a kind of use value, it seems more useful to try and cure cancer than it does to read books. So we're in a game that we can never win. And I wonder whether in some ways we ought to be braver about an alternative system of values, which is more like what Kathy said right at the end of the question period about maybe about a world without work. Maybe we've played a long time, we've been a long time trying to catch up with how we can prepare people for work. Maybe we could be front foot about this prospect of preparing people for not work.
Any other questions? So there's somebody there.
So, as you know, I work with secondary education, and I just the kind of the PATER approach, the personal growth model, as it gets called in secondary English teaching, was very popular in the 1980s. It was, and to when I began teaching, I guess, which is about 15 years ago. I was about to say getting on 20 years ago, and that was the approach, that it was about what you enjoyed, how it made you grow. And more recently, there's been what we might call a Collins approach, a much more instrumentalist approach, which is about cultural capital as a means for social mobility and social participation. And in particular, that model is very heavily driven among schools which work with lower socioeconomic status students. And so I wanted to ask, if we drive tertiary English towards being more PATER, does that risk excluding and driving out those who have come from from a lower socioeconomic status and haven't had access to that, or been allowed to think that that was a valid and viable means of exploring English literature, and possibly losing the gains that we've had in terms of widening participation over the last 15, 20 years?
I think that's, Felder, I think that's a really important question. I think that my anecdotal experience and my sense of the wider context is that we are losing those gains, that we've already, in some ways, that battle is lost, that the humanities are already seen as a kind of elite choice for higher education. I don't know whether that means that we should just accept that or fight against it. I mean, there are other models about. I wonder if it's unaskable whether we should be whether the humanities should be part of the full-time degree model that is so prominent in so dominant in UK higher education. Is that the best? I don't know if that's the best model necessarily for the humanities. If we were to think, that's why I was saying, the humanities were extramural for a long time. In some ways, that was when most people wanted to do them, and that was when they had most reach beyond traditional groups. Maybe we need to be a little bit more. I'm interested in more radical senses of what the university might be, which are coming out, round about now, which are about looking again at this residential 3-year model at this point in people's lives and thinking, is that the best way to do that? And I just wonder whether, since we in the humanities, more than any other subject, are prone to this kind of soul searching on what should we be doing, whether we couldn't actually be a bit more proactive in designing that rather than following on and trying to fit alongside models which have been created in other disciplines.
Sorry, one there and then one there.
I find that very interesting what you just said about extramural, because I spent most of my career in finance and financial journalism, and the number of people in their 40s and 50s or even 30s, 40s and 50s who would like to study something and learn something seems to me very large. You have this university-educated group in the middle classes or somewhat educated. They may have studied management or something useless like that, and they would like to learn, and they're now ready to learn in a way they probably weren't at age 19 when they want to study sex. So I think that's very appealing, and I'm wondering. The question is one does a lot of literary criticism, and literary criticism has become something of an art of itself. And does that make it more difficult to reach these people if you're trained in a kind of literary critical theory sort of thing? Or is that not, in a way, sort of cutting you off? It's a way to, as you say, to validate yourself as a serious scholar, to read a lot of complicated French words and say something about liminality for a few hours.
I think the point about I think if we are if one of our claims about the humanities is about sort of humane values and how to live well and joy and all those things, I'm not sure we should be teaching it to people when they're 18, actually. And I think what I was thinking about when Kathy was talking was your question then about mature students or people who come back to learning later on in life, and the sense that even if our graduate programs are not designed to produce mini-me academics, they are seen as beginning of career steps towards something. So they're seen as foundational in some way, and that's where they come in the chronology of someone's experience. I just wonder whether that's necessarily the right thing to do. The question about theory, I think I slightly resist, although I do have some sympathy with a history of English literature which looks at its desperate attempts to create a kind of a language of the elect, of the academic elite, and to distance that from other kinds of readers, so that to create a specialised reader against an unspecialised one. I do have some sympathy with that, but I don't feel that criticism in itself is a barrier. No, I don't feel that.
Sorry.
I'm a bit worried about the notion that studying literature is not work. I think even burning with a hard gem-like flame can be quite tough.
No, it's exhausting, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely exhausting. No, and if I suggested that it wasn't work, I don't mean that at all. I mean, that's my error in presenting what I was saying. No, I don't think it's easier. I really don't think it's easier. Not at all. I think it's directed to a different aim. But yeah, I think burning with a gem-like flame is a really difficult thing to encourage young people to do, since they're apt to do it anyway.
This gentleman behind there.
Both presentations, yours more specifically, addressed the population of professionals who are in graduate school and the problems faced today of motivating them, keeping them on track, and actually getting them jobs. But that's actually a very small part of the population of people interested in the humanities. And I think we should look more at that other population in terms of the survival of the humanities, because that is what's going to generate the jobs, obviously. And there's a second problem, which is most university education is now publicly funded in one way or another. So the public opinion of the worth and interest of something is going to impact the distribution of funding on institutions. There's no way around that. So my question to you is, shouldn't we be looking, it's actually a bit taking the opposite position you just took, that it is actually very important to initiate children and adolescents into the humanities, because it opens up an appetite that may be satisfied much better later on in other contexts. But without it, we're constraining ourselves and abandoning this type of education to emotional approaches that are largely computer-driven or distracting, modern technology-driven. So I would ask you, what about this large population of consumers? They don't want to be professors. They want the consolation all their life of learning that kind of approach to life.
I agree with a lot of what you said, and one of the things I tried to say at the end is I think the crisis in the humanities is a university problem. We mean the crisis in humanities departments. We do not mean the crisis in the reading of books, the attendance at the theatre, the distribution of interesting cinematic or rock music, or I don't think we do mean that. I don't feel that there is, in the UK context, a crisis in the humanities where arts or humanities are not valued. There is definitely a crisis in universities, which is about the distribution, the way funds, that centrally received funds, are reallocated out to different disciplines. That feels to me an institutional problem, which was why I thought about it institutionally, and I think probably why Cathy thought about it institutionally. But if you say, does this crisis about humanities education reflect, or at the moment at least, have as one of its impacts an impoverished artistic sphere, or a sphere of people who enjoy the arts? I don't think so. I don't see that. I see a whole range of, festivals, non-fiction publishing, podcasts, all kinds of media in which serious and enjoyable and entertaining engagement with humanistic ideas is really flourishing. So I do feel that the crisis in the humanities is an institutional crisis about what the university is for. And in my university, it's a crisis about an as-earned principle, which suggests that every part of your university business must wash its own face, rather than that the uni or the versity in university might be valuable. So that they feel to me institutional questions. But I completely agree that if we think about the relation between the the appreciation of the humanities and what that offers individuals and society, that I don't feel that's in crisis myself. Maybe I'm too naive about that. This is a problem for us in our universities about what we think the disciplines are.
Surely it's not about curing cancer or doing literature, because we are agent of culture. We want as many people as we can being able to participate in the conversation of literature and theater and film and all that, because we want a better society, a freer society, a democracy, which eventually will be a more economically successful society, I believe. So a question like, what's more important? Yeah, if to paraphrase the joke, we might not be making money, but we make the living worthwhile. And this is, it seems to me, does not need any advocacy, but I might be wrong.
Perhaps in this room it doesn't, but we are probably not signing the checks. I think when central funds are allocated out to different areas of activity in the university, I think that does matter actually, and I absolutely agree with you that it's a facile comparison, or it's a comparison of those low-hanging apples and oranges. That it doesn't work, but I think it's what operates. I do think it's what pertains in this. But I agree with you, and I agree with you about participation and engagement. I'm absolutely committed to that. Yeah.
Thank you. That was lovely. Can I pick you up on the topic that you raised briefly that I too find troubling, and I imagine many people do, which is that the crisis in the humanities, such as it is, and as you've helped to refine it, seems to be running in tandem with a change in the gender profile of the Academy of English Studies especially. And it's not just that, is it? Because the crisis in the humanities has also accompanied the greatest democratization of higher education that we've seen, the highest numbers going through the university at all. And if we look at the figures coming through from English schools, I think probably there are strong American parallels to this. We're also seeing quite a significant cultural change in the kinds of student, the ethnic background, especially of students who want to do English, which is really interesting and poses questions for us about what the objects of study should be, you know, how widely cast they should be, what the cultural studies remit of the subject is. So I guess I want to ask how far that alters the sense that it's an institutional problem, whether the answer simply has to be that the institution is too big and trying to do too much, and that some of the things it's trying to do reside beyond higher education, or whether, as we've tended to think until very recently, democratization can only be a good. The more people who come through the doors of the university, the better, and therefore our job is to hang on to those numbers and make the experience of the university as good, as qualitative as it can be. Sorry, that's a bit...
So they're really, really interesting questions, Helen. I think there are 2 points there. I do think the fact that the humanities are dominated by women at all levels, I'm afraid to say, has not helped the cause of the humanities in the wider university. And I think that's just, I think that the morphology of that is the morphology of the status of school teaching, or all kinds of professions, medical profession, all kinds of professions that, as they open to women, they lose status, and it's only. I do think that probably has an effect on important central governance things in the university, which decide what priorities there should be. I still think it's easier for the university, as for most institutions, to prioritise things that men advocate. And I'm sorry if that seems too sweeping a point, and people must come back at me if that's the case. The question, though, about why those people come is a different one. I mean, why is it? I mean, the consequences, I think, are quite clear, but I don't know that I absolutely understand the causes, but I can see that a kind of emotional or experiential notion of English as a discipline or humanities as disciplines is culturally likely to be more available to women in our society than it is to men, or to speak to gendered norms about how men and women behave, and that may just continue to reproduce that issue. So I don't know whether we should be trying to change. It's difficult for it's difficult for us because of for lots of reasons that have been designed to increase, particularly the participation by women in many public areas of the public sphere in which they have historically been disadvantaged. It's quite hard to turn that mindset round to thinking that if you've got too many women, that seems sort of problematic. So I do feel that gender in the humanities is something we don't talk enough about. I don't think we need to accept the way things are, but I do think there's a connection between status and participation.
Sorry, Michael, did you want to say something? I only have a silly story in response to it, though, but I always tell my students in the Shakespeare course that what we really should do after the first meeting is meet the next night at Dulles Airport, come to England, see Shakespeare's plays from the September to December, and then come home. And then we would be really honoring them as they should be honored as performance things to be performed. But I said, of course, you need your grubby credits in order to get your degree. We have to set some questions for it and so on. And I still haven't figured out the question that in which I can gauge what is it, how flaming their hearts are in response. And I think that's part of the problem the humanities faces, and I think you've encapsulated that in the talk, that we may be trying to we need to make it academic. We need to set questions. We need to grade them on something that is fundamentally an intimate and personal, something that evokes at its best an intimate and personal response, and helps them to see things more broadly and more clearly, particularly about themselves. And it's hard to find a question that will stand up on an exam if that's really what the goal is. So I think that I just wanted to say I think it puts you've made very clear one of the problems in my mind anyway about teaching the humanities. They don't quite fit into academic contexts.
Do you want to respond to that, or
Let's leave that.
Should we perhaps finish on that enigmatic note? I think, as you can see, Emma, your talk has raised a number of absolutely fundamental questions that you've managed to touch on, and I think the sign of a good talk is one in which everybody goes away with additional questions from the ones that they came with. And you've done that admirably, so many thanks. Thank you.